With over 20 years of combined recruitment experience, Bastion is your trusted advisor for sourcing leaders. Technical experts in supply chain recruitment, Bastion uses a proven customer-focused delivery. Speak to a consultant today for your recruitment needs. Bastion, experts in sourcing leaders that deliver change.
Hi everyone, you're watching another episode of Trade Australia. I'm your host, Lawrence Christoffelsz. Trade Australia is brought to you by the Australian Trade Logistics Corporation and all of our national sponsors. On today's episode, we're going to talk about all the latest free trade agreements. We're going to talk about the China and Australia trade situation, as well as some sustainable supply chain and the impacts on contracts and how you actually frame up a sustainable supply chain contract. To kick it all off, I'm delighted to be joined in studio here by Kristen Bondietti. Hi, Kristen, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Kristen, you're the director of Article 3. Can we kick off by talking about Article 3 and what you guys do, please?
Sure. So Article 3 is a trade policy and advisory business based here in Melbourne. And we help business navigate the complex trade rules and regulations that apply across borders and help business secure opportunities either to trade or invest into foreign markets. Yeah. And we have a particular expertise in free trade agreements in the Asia Pacific region.
Great. There's so many things with free trade agreements with Australia. I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we've really ramped up with a whole new range of agreements. And the latest one's RCEP, which I believe, you'll correct me, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Yes, that's
Is that
correct.
Right? Yes. And there's so many other free trade agreements that sit within this whole ASEAN region. Could you maybe, for the viewers and the audience, break down the current free trade agreements around ASEAN and how RCEP works, overlaps that or complements?
Sure. So RCEP effectively consolidates a whole heap of ASEAN regional trade agreements with the region. So at the core of RCEP is ASEAN and its 5 external trading partners that already currently have free trade agreements with ASEAN. China, Japan, Korea, Australia and New Zealand. And India was originally in the grouping but had also pulled out. So all of these economies have currently free trade agreements with ASEAN, and RCEP effectively brings them all together and creates one big free trade area with all of the 15 parties.
Wow. So one of the questions I had for you, and a lot of people talk about a free trade agreement versus an economic partnership agreement. What are the differences? What are the nuances between the two terminologies?
Well, that's an interesting question because often it is just words, but generally you find that if something is termed or an agreement is termed a free trade agreement, it tends to be more comprehensive than an economic partnership agreement. Okay. So you'll find that it covers not just tariffs, but also services, investment, maybe economic commerce, maybe electronic commerce, competition policy, and a wider scope of economic activity.
Mm-hmm. So we just had recently, I think it was 5th of July or 7th of July, the ratification for the ISEPA, the Indonesia-Australia Partnership Agreement. If I'm an importer, and let's say I'm importing or exporting to and from Indonesia, now RCEP's come in with ASEAN, how do I navigate which agreements I should be looking at? And obviously this is where you guys come in and say, look, let's look at your business and let's navigate how, what you should be taken away from each of those agreements. Is that right? How does that work?
Yes, so both agreements are operating and are effective, and there are many free trade agreements out there, which is true. It is very complex and can be very confusing. But all the agreements, whether they're termed an economic partnership agreement or whether they're termed a free trade agreement, are all treaties, and they all have binding provisions in them, obviously to varying degrees. So if you're an exporter and you're looking to know which agreement to use, and you can use either, it really comes down to the details. Yeah. So you need to look at a whole range of things. You look at your rules of origin, you might look at your market access terms, your tariffs. You might look at whether the agreement offers liberalisation of services that you might need to move your goods across borders, or you might need to use in their own right. Does it offer mobility for movement of people if transfer of personnel between jurisdictions is important to you? So really, the devil is in the detail. It really comes down to looking at the actual provisions and what the terms are of the agreements.
I think that's where so many companies get confused and quite overwhelmed, is because just like some of those points you just mentioned, Kristen, about the staffing and the way that you can actually access the market more than just the product movement itself. There's a whole range of other added considerations to think of, and what you want to do with the business, how you want to grow into that regional market, and which agreement may or may not work better for you. Is there a way that, I know the government provides a lot of broad-ranging sort of support, but if you look at the Austrade side or DFAT side, a lot of it's just like technical wording where you just think, okay, well, yes, I can read it, I can understand what it means, but I still need experts such as yourselves to work out how that actually customly fits and applies to my business. What's a typical sort of, what are the steps that a company should take when it comes to looking at all these FTAs or agreements around the world and say, okay, well, we know that we're in these countries or we want to be in these countries from our products or services. How do you normally, if I'm coming to you at Article 3 and I say, look, here's what we're doing, we know we're not getting the best out of our FTAs, what's the sort of steps that you'd normally take? How would you help us as importers or exporters?
Sure. Well, I think the first step is really understanding your supply chains and understanding what you're moving into what market. And once you know where your product is intended or is headed or your services are operating, it's then really just a matter of looking at what agreement offers what and mapping that against where you need to move. And again, it really just comes down to the detail of knowing what's in the agreement. And you're right, a lot of the information out there is very technical, but the agreements are quite technical and often you will need someone to help you navigate what that means. It may mean that you need to use one agreement like RCEP, or your markets are in that agreement. It may mean that you need to use various agreements across different segments of your supply chain in order to access the best tariff or use the best rules of origin or the services provisions. Yeah,
wonderful. I think that one of the other things I want to ask you is, you mentioned, you might have touched on this slightly at the start, was things like electronic and digital type of implementation now, or inclusions that countries have started to put in. I know back in the old days, it's probably showing my age a bit, is that we used to go and get certificates of origin stamped, whether it's ARG or Chambers of Commerce, and that would help with our FTA compliance. I mean, that's very old school now. But what are the sort of requirements now companies need to do to have proof of origin or proof of imports? Is there a lot more digital side of that, or do you still have to go in and get certificates and things like that stamped?
Okay, well, I'm actually not a customs a digital expert in that area, but I do know that it depends on the different agreements. So some of the agreements will allow self-certification, so the exporters can merely declare themselves whether they meet the requirements of the agreement. Other agreements tend to be a little bit more onerous, where they require certification from third parties in different economies. So again, it just depends on the agreement and depends on the product and how a business might be set up in a country to manage that.
Okay, great. What about this situation with the pandemic? I know that there's been when it first, the whole world sort of, had all these challenges about global trade, and everyone started looking inwards towards their own borders. And there's a whole discussion around, is global trade the way of the future, or are people going to be looking back domestically? With so many FTAs, what's your vision? I mean, what do you think is going to evolve with more future of global trade? And do you see more FTAs evolving between Australia and other markets?
I think now we've sort of got to the point where there are numerous FTAs, and in a way, particularly a country like Australia, we almost have an FTA with every one of our top trading partners. So in terms of there being more FTAs, perhaps not many, in my view, would see many more FTAs happening, because a lot of countries have already got FTAs with their major trading partners. But we now would be moving to a phase where we're starting to look about how we get more out of our existing FTAs. So whether that's we're going back to renegotiate or to upgrade them. For example, Australia is currently upgrading the Regional Free Trade Agreement with ASEAN, the ANZFTA, it's called in acronym speak, because that agreement is now over 10 years old and it needs to be updated with new provisions. And moving on from the current agreements that have been negotiated, they can form a baseline to improve liberalisation. So I think we're moving towards what can we do now to improve on what we've got, whether that's through more FTAs or whether it's through other types of agreements or arrangements to support trade as well, that are not specifically trade treaties as well.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful, Kristen. Just before we wrap up, can I ask, what would be your tips and advice for the viewers watching this episode, thinking, look, I hear about all these FTAs. I'm too, bogged down in my business to actually think about the details. I know our customer brokers and all that sort of stuff do the basics. What would be your tips and advice for companies or the viewers to say, how can you get the most out of their FTAs?
Look at the details. Know your business and know where to go to get advice if you need it. But there is a lot in the many FTAs. Most of them are 3,000 pages long. So there's a lot of detail in there, and there are benefits to be secured from the FTAs.
Great. Well, thanks so much again for joining us on today's show. I'm sure that all of you viewers out there who are trying to navigate, it does take experts like Kristen and her team at Article 3 to really get to tease the best out of these FTAs and how it can really make those real differences to your business and the future of the growth of these, especially around these regional areas as well. So thanks so much, and look forward to, if you need any help, reach out to Kristen and her team. We'll have all the details in the episode. So stick around. Coming up after the break, we'll be joined by Elisa de Wit from Norton Rose Fulbright, Australia, talking about contractual law and how sustainable supply chains have been impacted. So we'll see you very soon.
With over 20 years of combined recruitment experience, Bastion is your trusted advisor for sourcing leaders. Technical experts in supply chain recruitment, Bastion uses a proven customer-focused delivery. Speak to a consultant today for your recruitment needs. Bastion, experts in sourcing leaders that deliver change.
Welcome back, everyone. You're watching another episode of Trade Australia. Joining me now is Elisa de Wit, who's the Head of Climate Change and Partner at Norton Rose Fulbright, Australia. So thanks for joining us, Elisa. How are you?
My pleasure. Thanks, Lawrence. I'm very well.
Great. Look, there's so many things I'd love to talk to you about, and I'm sure there's probably going to be another opportunity to chat with you in more detail because your topic around this interview around sustainability and climate change and the impacts around supply chain. I think we could do a whole episode on this, but first and foremost, what do you see, Elisa, as a specialist in this area, around how companies are tackling things like sustainability and climate change in their own supply chains?
So I think the first thing I'd say is that there's been a huge kind of leap in terms of understanding of this issue and also the focus on needing to look at this issue. And obviously there's been a number of different drivers which have led to that. But if we think about it from perhaps the global context first, we obviously have as our kind of global setting the Paris Agreement, which essentially sends out the trajectory as to the way that both countries and governments, but also the business community needs to start looking forward. And one of the dramatic developments that we've seen probably over the last 2 to 3 years is businesses now setting net zero targets. So the idea behind that is that by 2050 or thereabouts, businesses and countries should be in a position where their emissions profile has been reduced as much as possible, but where for any of those emissions that can't be reduced, we're looking at how we offset those emissions. And so focusing companies' minds on how they're going to achieve a net zero aspiration or target really means they're looking at, well, what is our emissions footprint? What does it look like? Where can we reduce emissions? But also increasingly, what do we do to offset the emissions that we can't actually reduce? So I think that's probably been one of the most dramatic developments over the last 2 years. And I feel like the corporate sector has really stepped up in recent times, even more perhaps than you would say the government's doing. But it's really driving the way forward in terms of how they're looking at sustainability, but particularly emissions reduction and offsetting.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, from a layman's terms perspective, all of us in importing and exporting land, especially from an SME perspective, we've probably only been exposed to offsetting when you jump on a flight and tick, do you want to offset your flight by paying an extra $5 or whatever it may be. So I think, in our mind as consumers, we think, okay, someone's going to plant an extra tree every time I do this type of thing. And I'm not sure. I'm sure the corporate world are doing so many different things and unique things. What are the type of initiatives or programs that you might be able to give them some insight or awareness to about, say, look, if I put my hand up as a corporate or even as an SME for that matter, and say, look, Elisa, we want to do our bit. We want to make sure that we're, as part of our corporate governance, we want to do the right thing by the climate change, sustainability. From a consumer perspective, we want to make sure that we're demonstrating to our consumers that we're proper corporate, social, responsible citizens. How do you sort of advise them about, okay, here's some ideas, or here's some frameworks? I'm sure there's so many.
So in an Australian context, the main framework is what's called Climate Active, which kind of was rebadged, but essentially is a program that's been in place for some years now, run by the federal government. And essentially, the way you participate in that is you register to come in and be part of the program, but you obviously need to map out your emissions footprint, and you also need to look at what commitments you're making in terms of carbon neutrality. And if there is an offsetting requirement, then there are certain restrictions about what kind of offsets you can buy in order to surrender those to offset your emissions. I think one of the, so that's kind of the main kind of government framework, but what we are seeing is a lot more activity in what we call the voluntary sector. So this is companies, and perhaps the best example of this in recent time is Telstra, where they decided that they were going to be carbon neutral. So essentially to achieve that goal, they went out and they purchased a whole lot of carbon offsets to enable them to make that claim. What we are increasingly seeing is not only companies saying, well, I'm going to go and buy these offsets, but actually I'd quite like to invest in these offset projects myself so that I've got control over the generation of the offsets, but also so that I can choose what type of offset project I might want to invest in. And we're seeing kind of real interest in offsetting where it has additional co-benefits. So, for example, under the Australian scheme, there are all different types of projects that can be done, but one example where there's a fantastic co-benefit is where you're doing activities that involve Indigenous communities. So where you're undertaking burning programs that allow less emissions to be released into the atmosphere, but also are generating employment for your Indigenous communities. There's some amazing projects being done at the moment in the context of the Great Barrier Reef, and looking at ways that we can ensure that runoff is not taking place, sediments not being released, nitrogen, etc., into the Great Barrier Reef. So there are all of these additional benefits that we can get from doing these projects, as well as just the carbon offsetting component. And I think a lot of companies increasingly are seeing that there's a wonderful PR story to go with their offsetting activity.
Yeah, I think what you've just touched on there is really powerful as well, Lisa, is that there's almost a competitive, marketing push for so many companies to say, look, we're doing this first, we're becoming neutral, we've got these targets as our own right, and they're doing it as a point of difference across as part of their competitive landscape, it's great because I think everyone benefits from that. And I think that also demonstrates that consumers, especially in Australia, are really making conscious buying decisions, and they are increasingly becoming more aware of which brands and companies they want to support because of these type of initiatives.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is it's the drivers, if you like, or the kind of push is coming from so many different angles. So you're absolutely right. Consumers are definitely driving a lot of this activity in terms of their purchasing power, and whether they decide that they want to buy a good or product that has a lower carbon footprint than another one. But what we're increasingly seeing is that it's also very much a top-down approach. So the investment world has really kind of understood now the need for the business and corporate sector to step up and to start taking action, particularly in relation to some of these targets that have been announced. And so we're seeing a lot of shareholder activism and increased focus around transparency and ensuring that clients and companies are assessing their climate risks. So it's not just a matter of, standing up and saying we're going to be carbon neutral. It's also a matter of assessing, well, what are the climatic impacts that this organisation might be faced with, and also what are those transitional risks as well? What does a net zero world look like for our company and our business? how are we going to best position ourselves to thrive in that future world?
Mm. And I'd love to ask you, Elisa, about the global supply chains, especially us here in Australia. You know, we rely so heavily on imports, I should say. Is that have you noticed? Because have you noticed that a lot of procurement departments and the whole range of their buying decisions now are increasingly encompassing some of these factors, whether it's through ethics or sustainability or the ways that they can actually capture and monitor the type of footprint that those suppliers are making themselves?
Absolutely. So that is obviously one of the best ways in terms of procurement decision making to get these outcomes, which is to look across your supply chain and to impose requirements on your supply chain in terms of their emissions footprint. And we know that that what we call scope 3 emissions, so those downstream emissions that you don't have any control over yourself, are increasingly receiving more focus. And, you know, the likes of BHP and others that have said, we understand that we need to look at the scope 3 emissions. We need to work with our suppliers so that we can help them also transform their businesses and start looking at ways that they can reduce their emission footprint within their own business. One thing I thought I'd mention, Lawrence, which is a kind of a new concept which is getting some traction, is rather than a pure offset approach, is something that's called insetting. And this is a scenario where someone looks to do a project but within their supply chain. So rather than just going and buying offsets from some random project, they say, well, we'll invest that money within our supply chain to essentially work together to get an outcome. And so an example of that might be Nespresso, who have a whole lot of coffee plantations around the world, and they decide that actually to assist their landholders who supply the coffee, they actually want to assist them to put in place more trees, for example, to do the sequestration activity. And so they will work together to kind of get a mutual benefit, if you like, but also get a benefit that is great in a sustainability and emission reduction context. So I think we'll increasingly see that kind of behaviour as well, where you've got your suppliers and your customers actually working together to achieve outcomes.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that's a great example, I think, Elisa. And, you know, some of the things that I'm seeing from a supply chain perspective is that the actual end of life of products as well, so the full PLM, product lifecycle management, about the disposability of, even, as you mentioned, Nespresso with the coffee pods, and there's some great initiatives that companies are now really thinking much beyond the consumer purchase. They're thinking about the disposability. So that's a whole new evolution of ways that they can make a positive impact as well.
Yeah, and so certainly that kind of whole concept of the circular economy, of making sure that we are looking to, recycle, reduce, recover, reuse, all of that is very much being enshrined in terms of new product generation and new product design as well.
Wonderful. Look, it's been, as I said at the outset, there's so many things I'd love to talk to you about. And I definitely have, I'd love to reach out and speak to you again on some other specific shows around some of these insetting, offsetting, some of these new terminologies that companies would love to hear more about. I know our viewers and audience would hear these type of discussions and think, yes, how do I find out more? How do I, transition our business to become better at all these things? And even in a way, there's I'm guessing there's probably even stronger increasing ways to demonstrate ROI by investing in these type of initiatives for their own businesses as well. So, look, I'd love to, again, get you back on another show in the future. Just finally, at least before we wrap up today's episode, what are the tips and advice you'd give to the viewers here who are predominantly importers and exporters, or even supply chain partners who watch these type of shows and thinking, okay, well, we want to be better corporate citizens, we want to make a positive impact. What tips and advice would you give them to start them on this journey?
Yeah. So I think it's clear that you need to look at that future horizon, and you need to take a long-term view in terms of the trajectory that the world is hopefully on now in terms of moving to a low-carbon future. And as I said, really start thinking about how well your company is positioned for that future. It's obviously, information is key. So having a full understanding of your emission footprint and where possible, your scope 3, your downstream emissions is obviously essential. So then you can start to give consideration to what changes can be made within your business activities to look at how you can reduce emissions, and in an ideal world, set your own long-term targets. And then, as I said, the concept of offsetting, I think, is just key, and clearly getting more information around what offsets are there to purchase, the different projects that generate them. And that's really just an education piece. There's lots of information, though, that is available to provide that level of information. I'm on the board of the Carbon Market Institute, which has a website where there's heaps of information that can be found about carbon offset projects and carbon credits. So if you are looking at going on that offsetting journey.
Fantastic. It's been an absolute delight to have you on the show, Elisa. I appreciate that. Congratulations on all the great work you're doing with those many roles that you do work through. So, and as I said before, I'd love to talk with you again on another specific episode around circular economy, which I think you'd be an ideal guest to really contribute to that type of discussion in the longer term as well. So thanks once again. Let's stay in touch, and wishing you all the best for the end of the year.
My pleasure. Thanks, Lawrence, for having me.
Thank you, Elisa. So you've just heard from Elisa de Wit, who is the Head of Climate Change at Norton Rose Fulbright, Australia. She's got a wealth of knowledge and experience around how they can transform companies and make sure that they are becoming better with their climate change and corporate social responsibilities as an overall. So stick around after the break. We'll be joined by Darryl Daisley from Pitcher Partners over in WA. See you very soon.
With over 20 years of combined recruitment experience, Bastion is your trusted advisor for sourcing leaders. Technical experts in supply chain recruitment, Bastion uses a proven, customer-focused delivery. Speak to a consultant today for your recruitment needs. Bastion, experts in sourcing leaders that deliver change.
Welcome back, everyone. You're watching another episode of Trade Australia. Now joining me all the way from WA is Darryl Daisley, who's a director at Pitcher Partners over there. He's a trade specialist, and I've asked Darryl to come on the show to talk about this really important issue around the China-Australia trade tensions. Thanks so much for joining me, Darryl. Great to see you again.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. Nice to be part of the program again.
Mate, my pleasure. Darryl, let's dive into it. Look, there's so much going on with China and Australia. These trade tensions seem to be getting worse week after week. Can you explain to the viewers? I know that you're a trade specialist and you're across these type of situations. So absolute pleasure to get you on the show to pick your brain with this. What does it mean? What's going on, and where do you think it's heading?
Look, it's been an amazing year, and the main thing for me is that it's the geopolitics behind our trading relationships. And they've really come to the fore. So I've made a list of about a dozen points in relation to China, of what we can actually talk about, what's happening. I mean, even overnight, you might have seen the press reports today. So another beef company's been targeted and has been hit, to the extent that the CEO, when he was interviewed, he only found out himself 5 minutes earlier and is just trying to work out what they're going to do.
Wow.
So, that's the fifth beef company since middle of the year. So there'd been no action around beef for a number of months, and then lo and behold. So look, if I take a step back, China's turned around and said, well, they provided a paper that had 14 grievances on it in relation to Australia's internal and external issues, where China has taken an issue with. And the first one was certainly the public announcement by the Australian government, and primarily one or two ministers, around the investigation around COVID. And then it's kind of snowballed from there. So if I think back, 2 weeks ago, the Chinese imposed significant security deposits on the wine exporters. Everyone's talking about tariffs. They're actually a security deposit, but effectively a tariff. Now, that investigation started in August. It's going to run for 12 months.
Wow.
12 to 18 months. And this is an interim measure that a country is able to impose and China's gone ahead and done an interim measure. Essentially, they undertook an investigation. Australian wine producers had to respond to that investigation. On the back of it now, they've been levied with 107% up to 212% security deposit. So it's effectively stopped that trade in that product pretty much overnight. Now, we've had a number of discussions because a number of our clients are directly impacted. And there is an out, believe it or not. So that action was on a product that was 2 litres or less.
Okay.
Which is your 750ml bottle. But the products that are greater than 2 litres and less than 10 litres are still duty-free.
So back to casks then.
Correct. Well, or a bladder product which you might be able to export up to China and get it bottled in country.
Ah, great idea.
But that's a significant shift to the supply chain, from what Australian exporters may have been doing. And we've certainly had some discussions with a number of exporters around that. And this is the issue. When you look at the trade measure that's been put in place, you've got to look at it very, very closely. So those security deposits were around one tariff line. All the other wine tariff lines are still afforded significant preference under CHAFTA, under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement.
Wow.
But, are you able to pivot and change that supply chain? And there's probably still some sensitivity. So, our advice was maybe 1 or 2 test shipments.
Yeah.
And just see how it goes.
Yeah, don't go change your production line just yet.
Correct. So, so we've had, beef today, wine 2 weeks ago, the barley issue. This is an interesting one from a supplier or an exporter's perspective. So back in May, you had tariffs of around about 80% placed on barley products going up to China. So thankfully, the farmers were able to pivot and move that product to other markets, whether it be Japan, Indonesia, or Vietnam rather, and the Middle East. And they've actually had good sales of those products over the last 6 months. So the government only last week said, right, we're now seriously considering we're going to take that to the WTO, which is following the rules-based system that we're part of. So they're potentially going to be able to bring China into a room to discuss, the issue and have an independent arbitrator look at it. But that's taken 6 months for the government to make that decision.
Yeah.
And it's an issue that won't be resolved for 2 or 3 years. So as an actual exporter of the product, can you wait 6 months for the government to make a decision? Can you wait 2 to 3 years in respect of determining trade in that particular market? And to carry on, the next major thing that the government seems to be talking about is being able to diversify. Diversify. And as you may appreciate, it's very difficult for Australian businesses to suddenly try and decouple from China. And we don't want to decouple from China. I mean, they're our largest trading partner. But then to be able to quickly and rapidly assess other markets, change that supply chain, identify new freight routes, get new rates, it doesn't happen overnight.
No. It takes significant research, significant time to design all that framework and infrastructure for sure.
Yeah, correct. So, and I think the disappointing thing from business is we're not seeing any, real strategy or plan as to how to, the term is off-ramp with China. How do we, tone it down, take the heat out of these discussions? Because bizarrely, I don't know if you know, but the iron ore price at the moment is the highest since March of 2013 at $145 US dollars per tonne. And the Chinese are buying more of our iron ore than ever.
Yeah.
So, they've got a very, very strong nexus with that one particular commodity, which underscores what they need to do domestically around their infrastructure. So the question has been, certainly in WA, is iron ore going to figure in this trade war? And look, there's probably a growing concern that possibly, but I think realistically, the Chinese don't have a viable alternative.
Yeah.
So Brazil, is where they get some part of their iron ore supply. That's been impacted through some environmental issues. COVID's impacted some of their mines. The African potential exports of iron ore. That's a number of years away.
Yeah.
So really Australia sits in a very, very good position in respect of the export of that particular commodity to China.
So is that something, Darryl, that the government is looking at to counter some of the other challenges that China's imposing on Australian exports?
Well, I don't know about the federal government, but the state governments are saying, let us deal with, because obviously from a Western per the iron ore royalties are huge. So we get an extra $80 million per dollar above about $65 a tonne.
Wow.
So it's like, and Mark McGowan, the Labor Premier over here, is very mindful of that relationship. And they're kind of saying, look, the federal government aren't overly helping, but the relationship at that state level with the Chinese buyers is very, very good. Yeah. So one thing that has probably become extremely obvious is that we've got a high degree of reliance on China to buy our products. So I think the wine industry, it was 40% of all wine exported was going to China. So we've got this very strong relationship with China across various commodities, and it's been there for a number of years. And a lot of the interesting criticism is, well, now we're in trouble with that major market. We should have been looking at these other markets. And I think it's fair criticism, really, when you consider that Austrade, they've got most of their overseas offices in one market, in the China market. So we don't have, those kind of offices in some of the emerging markets through the ASEAN countries. So it's almost like we've been piling in on a single market that we're doing very, very well in, and then suddenly we've got an issue with that relationship, and they want us to pivot and diversify, but we don't have those similar relationships with our other ASEAN, for argument's sake, ASEAN trading partners. So I think there is, I think it's highlighted that everyone's been blinded by this sensational relationship we have with China, and I think it will improve, but it's going to take some time. But the allocation of resources has been misplaced.
I agree. I think, Darryl, what we noticed from a supply chain perspective, as soon as COVID hit, from an inbound point of view, all the products coming in from China dried up because that COVID impact straight away. So there's a whole range of de-risking to look at alternative supply markets. But from an export point of view, I think more so than COVID has been this China trade war that really Australian exporters have had to stand up and think, you know what, we need to look at all these alternatives. ASEAN is a perfect example of those. We've got Vietnam and Indonesia and Malaysia. And yes, from a wine perspective, some of those don't take a lot of wine, but other markets do. And there's a lot of other Australian export commodities that would work really well in those ASEAN markets. So it is, it's been a very important and overdue, I agree with you, wake-up call, if you like, and I think the government has put too much focus on one market. Agreed.
Look, correct. And then juxtaposed with that is the signing of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was only a couple of weeks ago. And there's probably some differing views around, what is RCEP truly China with ASEAN and no US, like the TPP was going to be the US with no China. But what's kind of eventuated with RCEP is it's ASEAN centric. China is part of it for sure, but it's quite an ASEAN centric multilateral agreement, and really well led by Vietnam over the last 12 months to get everyone together for signing. So bizarrely or interestingly, China is party to that, and that's a multilateral agreement. It's, subject to a rules-based system. There's some streamlining of origin requirements, certification requirements under that particular free trade agreement. So we're a party to it. China's a party to it.
Well, I think a lot of people are hoping that the RCEP is a bridge that brings China and Australia back together. Do you see that being the case?
Oh, look, possibly, but I mean, it's still got to go through our domestic processes. Probably not going to enter into force until maybe the middle of 2021. And it's less about goods and more about services. Okay. But I guess it's another example that the region is supportive of multilateral agreements, free trade, movement of services, relevant services, and China's part of it.
Yeah.
So I think it provides, it does certainly provide an opportunity to try and re-engage with China. Yeah. But certainly, when you hear stories, and they're not anecdotal, where Birmingham says he's not been able to talk to his counterpart for the last 12 months, even longer, that's a terrible situation to be in.
Yeah.
So it's and I'm I was quite surprised by the announcement this morning of a fifth beef exporter being impacted. So when's this going to stop?
Yeah.
The Chinese have been asking for a change in language from the federal government. It's not really coming. There's some legislation going through at the moment around foreign interference. And if it gets passed, then the MOU that the Victorian government has signed around the Belt and Road Initiative will be called into question. Relationships with universities and their research projects with foreign countries, including China, would be in the mix. So they're trying to push that through before the Senate shut down, and that's just going to further inflame the relationship.
Yeah, interesting times. It's definitely hard to see how things are going to get back into more friendly terms, because, as you say, there's a few things yet to play out, especially on this side of the fence with Australia. And I think that I know here, being in Victoria, that the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is something that looks like it's pretty much accepted, I think, from people here in the state, that it's going to be cold because of the federal law. And once that gets passed, I think.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've heard some commentary that might have been a program that the federal government could actually align itself with. And that would potentially send an olive, or hold out an olive branch to the Chinese, that if the federal government was prepared to support that Belt and Road Initiative, and that's really supporting potential infrastructure in the region, whether it be the land-based corridor or the sea corridors. So certainly some of the academics have been suggesting that might be one good or one potential measure that would signal to the Chinese, that Australia would love to see it, a de-escalation in the current tensions.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, one positive could be, the US election outcome.
Mm-hmm.
With the Biden administration starting in January, their dialogue with China is going to be slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Their dialogue with us could be slightly different as well.
Yeah.
But for argument's sake, I don't see the US reducing the current tariffs, that they've got on with China. But I think the language in the discussion is going to be different.
Yeah, I think Biden's got a reputation, from what I understand, of being much more of a deal maker, much better negotiator, to try and to get to middle ground. And hopefully, once that administration comes in, I think that might, as you say, soften some of the language and maybe bring Australia back into that fold as well.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. Because with the current tensions, you soon find out who your allies are and who they aren't. And, for 38% of the Chinese market, from a wine perspective, to be suddenly shut down to Australian wine, I've already heard stories of the Americans, the South Americans, the French, are very sorry for our position, but they're more than happy to help backfill, that very large chunk of that market with their product.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think definitely that's a massive hole that they'd all love to fill, because, as you say, Australian wine has got an increasingly global reputation of fantastic wine, and that sort of roadblock is it's people will be chomping at the bit to get their hands on that market.
Absolutely, and that issue on that wine product being less than that 2 litre size.
Yeah.
It's like the Chinese have, they started the investigation a couple of months ago. It could run for 12 months. These security deposits could run for a 4-month period, or they could push it out for a 6 to 9 month period. At the end of the investigation, those tariffs could come off, or they could remain, or they could go even higher.
Wow.
But as an exporter, then what do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, I heard a state government representative say, you've still got to, keep going, keep on keeping on with China. And I just feel like saying, well, what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly.
You're not going to export your product knowing that it's going to be potentially hit with a 212% tariff, which you would normally pass on to your consumer. So they're going to suddenly start paying, they might have been paying $15, $20 for a bottle. Are they going to start paying $40 or $50 for that same product? Probably not.
No, I think it's there's a lot more to play out. It's been always a pleasure to chat with you again, Darryl, and I think we'll need to get you back on the show very soon as this all continues to evolve. We'd love to speak to you again. It's some great insight, and it shows how important and valuable your type of expertise is, even with this 2 litre versus 750 ml type of, that sort of threshold, most people would never know. I mean, it's the first time I've heard about it, and I'm talking to people literally every day. So it's a great testament to how much you and your team actually go through some of the detail. So congratulations on that, and it just demonstrates to the viewers out there why they need to get in touch with people like yourselves to really help navigate their business, not just with China, but across all trade opportunities, and say, well, how can we make sure that we're getting the most out of our trade? How can we make sure that we're navigating this in the right way? And deal with experts such as yourself can really make or break in this type of example how they can continue to grow their market.
No, you're right, Lawrence. Look, presently, if you open up a paper, this is my closing remarks, on a daily basis, you will see one of 2 topics. It's either international trade or it's cybersecurity.
Yeah, you're right.
And we spoke about this, some time ago, many years ago. You might see something every 6 months. Well, thanks to Trump, it's come down to daily, and at the moment, we've got US Brexit, trade wars. I mean, so trade is figuring particularly highly, in all the major press, as it should.
And look, that's the whole purpose of this whole channel, the whole Import-Export TV, because there is so much content now that we couldn't fit it into one show. We actually created the channel because there is so much to talk about, and it's not going away. It's actually getting more complex, more interesting, and everyone doing business, especially here in Australia, is in some shape or form is doing a global business.
Yep, and we're all impacted.
Always great to catch up with you, mate. Good. Stay safe in WA. Hopefully we can catch up for a beer sometime soon. And all the best for Christmas if we don't speak to you before then.
Yeah, fabulous. Thanks again, Lawrence, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Darryl. So you've just heard from Darryl Daisley, who's a director over there in Pitcher Partners. You've heard some great advice, some great insights about how you can really try and get your head around what's going on with the China-Australia tensions, but also look at the detail and speak to Darryl and his team about what you might be able to really uncover with your own business and how you can navigate your way through some of these challenges. Thanks again for watching another fantastic episode of Trade Australia. I hope you found it informative and some insights that can really help grow your business and maybe answer some of the questions you might have been thinking. Look forward to joining you again next week, where we've got another fantastic episode coming up for you. Take care. Cheers.
With over 20 years of combined recruitment experience, Bastion is your trusted advisor for sourcing leaders. Technical experts in supply chain recruitment, Bastion uses a proven customer-focused delivery. Speak to a consultant today for your recruitment needs. Bastion, experts in sourcing leaders that deliver change.